This summer it seems like I have had a tremendous interest in reawakened quickening to look at the patriarchs, and we spent a few weeks ago 3 Sunday nights looking at Jacob and lessons for our lives from his, and I want now to take 3 Sunday nights and share with you some insights from the man Joseph, whose story begins in the 37th chapter of the book of Genesis. And I'm calling this series How Dreams Come True. Joseph is the most consistent dreamer in the Scripture, outside of another person that bears his name in the New Testament, another Joseph, the, how would you call him, the stepfather of Jesus, the husband of Mary, a great dreamer. And tonight, part one, I suppose if I were to subtitle it, I would call it Surviving Your Childhood. There are some people who have not successfully survived their childhood and their adolescence, may have survived it biologically, but that doesn't mean that one has survived it psychologically or spiritually. I was intrigued with the story I was reading in, I think it was the Register today, of a school crossing guard, a woman in her early 30s in Santa Ana, who had a series of affairs with 12 different police officers, which have put them all in jeopardy. Several of them have lost their jobs. And she was commenting upon what those relationships meant to her, and she simply indicated that really the relationship she had with the men wasn't really what was meaningful to her. It was being held, that somehow she was reaching out through those relationships because she grew up in a family situation where her father had never expressed any love for her verbally or physically, ever reached out to hug her or say, "I love you," and she felt that her needs for longing, as she is working that problem now through in psychoanalysis, is stemming from that time. Well, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I don't attempt to pass on a judgment as to whether that feeling is valid or not. I do think that many times we can put blame on others and not take responsibility ourselves, but let's face it, there are some people who do not survive childhood and adolescence well. And this is a concern for us, if we have survived it, because it concerns us as we become parents, if God has that as a calling for our life, of how we're going to transmit to our children. And I see in Joseph 3 strikes against him right off the bat when you encounter him, and I'd like to talk to you this evening about those 3 strikes and the antidote that was in Joseph's life that resisted those negative marks against him. The first strike against Joseph, by all odds, had to be his family situation. If you have grown up in a confused family situation, you have no idea, no matter how confused it was, probably the confusion that existed in Joseph's household. Maybe you did. We do live in a day of serialized parenting, where a child growing up in America may go through a number of parents in the course of their adolescent years. But Joseph had a situation where he had a number of parents all present at the same time, a number of older figures present. We know that his father had 2 wives and 2 concubines. The concubines that were alongside of the wives were really, in effect, what we would regard almost as legal wives within our culture. And to cope with that situation, he also had 11 other brothers and 1 sister that we know, and probably a lot of other sisters that are not named. We know that some of the adults in his life, especially his stepmothers, the other wives of Jacob, could not have been perhaps the most positive influences upon his life. Leah had real problems with her own self-image. We know that she knew she was not pretty. We know that she knew she did not have Jacob's favor. And we know also that she had participated in her wedding week as a partner with her own father to deceive Jacob into marrying her. That's quite a way to get a husband, by the way, to participate in deceiving him to wind up with the man that you love. Well, Leah paid a drastic consequence for this. Later, when Bilhah and Zilpah came into Jacob's life as his concubines and children were born by them, that contributed to the family milieu. I mentioned a few weeks ago that we must avoid the mistake of looking at Jacob from our own culture and from the light of the gospel. We know that archaeologists in the Near East have uncovered contracts of marriage that obligated a barren wife at the time of marriage to provide a substitute woman to have children in the event that the wife herself was barren. Jacob was simply following the custom of the day. The law of Moses had not yet been given, so we can say all those things even though he had some revelation of God. It's interesting to see as Joseph emerges that he does not become like his father Jacob, nor does he become like his grandfather Abraham, who themselves had concubines, but rather he becomes a person of a higher moral order. But we can well realize that there was an awful lot of sibling rivalry in the family, and I think that any one of us could excuse Joseph for not having a dream, for not having any goals. He, after all, was the 11th son. That means that one son followed him, Benjamin, and anyone in a large family knows that the baby son always gets the best treatment, right? And so Joseph only had it for a year or two, and then all of that passed away with Benjamin coming into existence. And somehow, though, he was a child who pleased, became the favorite of his father. And he could have become something else. He could have said, my environment has made me what I am. There's no chance growing up in a household like this. There's no opportunity in Palestine for me. I'll never succeed in my family because I was not the oldest born. Therefore, there is no special lot that I'm going to play in life. I'll just pass out my years of existence like any other person. He could have pointed to the negative factors and chosen not to do anything. But the fact was that he chose to have a dream. He even rejected the possibility, I think, of living in comfort, although God brought that circumstance about in his life. His family situation, if you would look at him as a modern counselor or a psychologist, you would have had to say that this little 11th son growing up in this home did not have a great deal going for him that would write his name in any kind of history book or become an example for people for centuries to come. But yet something very significant happened. I am always impressed with the story of people who have excuses for checking out but don't. And I suppose when we look at whatever background you come from, if you feel that you had a strike against you with your family situation, there comes a moment in your life where you've got to be a man or a woman. And you have to say, if you're ever going to come through to spiritual maturity, I must leave the things, I must forget the things that are behind, and I must press toward the future. We cannot afford as Christians to slip into a Freudian kind of mindset that simply says, my past and my environmental conditioning has made me what I am. Sooner or later, we have to take responsibility. We may say, my father or my mother did this, and my church did that, and this person did that, and so forth, but ultimately we must say, I take responsibility for that. Life is now in my hands. It's going to be, with God's help, what I choose to make it. And I can choose to be enriched by my negative experiences by turning them into positives in my life and seeing God work for the good, or I can go all of life carrying that chip on my shoulder, carrying that wound in my personality, never dealing with it. And I see many people today never dealing with their past because somehow it's been communicated, perhaps through our humanistic psychology and the like, that you simply have to be whatever you have, whatever has been made of you. And this is simply not true. Joseph does not live becoming the person that his family lifestyle situation represented. One of my favorite persons, as you're perhaps aware because I think I've shared her story once or twice before in the last almost 13 years now I've been pastor of this church, so some stories I've used more than once, but most of you I don't think I've heard this. This is one of the greatest stories in history. Would you like to hear it again if you've heard it before? Good, I'm going to tell it anyway. It's in my notes and I cannot violate my notes. It's the story of a lady who lived in the 18th century by the name of Susanna Wesley, the mother of John Wesley, the great English revivalist and preacher who almost single-handedly, by the power of God, brought a great Reformation to England. Susanna Wesley was born to a pastor family. Her dad was a bishop in the Anglican Church. She was the last child born in the family, but as the last child, she was not the third or the fourth child, that is the last. She was the 24th or the 25th child born in her family. The reason why we say 24th or 25th is that biographers of her have actually not able to establish which number she was. They call her either the second dozenth or the quarter of 100th kid. We do know that she was the last. And she could have grown up in that kind of atmosphere saying, I was born an afterthought. Obviously, my coming into the world was not planned. She could have said, as surely the 24th or the 25th kid would have said in a family, all I get to wear is the hand-me-down clothes. She could have said, I was born a woman in a chauvinistic culture. and therefore there's nothing I can make of my life. Women do not even have the privilege of going to the same levels of schooling as men do. She could have used all those kinds of things that would have excused her existence and allowed her to settle sort of into the normalcy of whatever the 24th or 25th kid did in a family. Not too many people have had that experience. But she chose to reject all those avenues of life, and she chose to make something with her life. Somehow there was a fire in her that began to build even as a girl. By the time she was a teenager, about 15, 16, 17 years of age, she had successfully learned New Testament Greek, French, and Latin, and theology. And she loved to sit at the dinner table when her father entertained ministerial guests and partake of the conversation, something which good girls didn't do in those days. Theology was man's talk. But she could hold her own in a heavyweight situation. Her father would often have to kind of tell her to cool it, to be quiet and let the men talk. But she didn't let that background stymie her development. She did not say, my environment has made me what I am, last kid in the family, I don't get attention the 24 hours a day, I just get a small slice of my parents' time, whatever. None of that. When she was 19 years of age, she herself married. In the next 21 years, she gave birth to 19 children. Now, some of those children did die at an early age. Child mortality rate was rather high in those days. I think somewhere between 12 to 15 of her children grew to maturity. She married a preacher, except her husband was not the preacher her father was, and he happened to be a very poor man, a poor preacher who was gone a lot. One of his dreams in life was to write a book that would be widely read, and Sam Wesley never attained to that distinction. In fact, he spent some of his life in debtor's prison. And he would sometimes go away from their country parish to preach in the city or be gone for an extended period of time, sometimes in a debtor's prison. And when he would leave, the church would be about 30 to 40 people, and Susanna Wesley would take over the ministry during the time that he was gone. Of course, she realized that God was an equal opportunity employer, and so she would take over the church, and when her husband, Samuel Wesley, got back, she'd turn the parish back over to him with the attendance running 200 strong. It would soon go back to 30 or 40, but that was okay. Susanna Wesley, with all of those children born in that period of time, could have said things like, I just can't keep track of the kids. And there's not a thing I can do with this brood of humanity around my legs all day long. These children are driving me nuts. My husband's gone all the time. What can you expect for me to accomplish? And I can't even get the decent things of life. I can hardly feed my family. Of course, my wife always loves me using the story of Susanna Wesley. It becomes kind of a joke between us. If I feel that she could do a little bit better, I'll say, but remember Susanna Wesley, and that's sure to send a dagger down the... Oh, that's just kidding. Susanna Wesley, however, chose not to live with all of these kinds of things that she could have said as the mother of that many children. What she did say is very significant. A phrase comes out of her life that shaped and molded church history, and indeed the history of the planet. She said this phrase, order is heaven's first law. Order is heaven's first law, and she insisted that order be brought into her household. And here's how the order transposed itself to the lives of her children. From the time a baby was born until they were 3 months of age, they were changed on schedule. Rather than on the basis of need, they were changed on a set schedule, and they were put to sleep on a set schedule. Whether they slept or not, they learned right from day one to begin operating on schedule. I don't know how in the world she did this, but I suppose if you were bringing a child into the world about every year, you would have to adopt some sort of system. It is said that in the Wesley house, by the time any child reached 1 year of age, they had all learned to cry softly. Well, you can imagine with the number of preschoolers, you couldn't have this loud crying going on. All her children had learned to cry softly by the time they were 1 year of age. When a child could learn to talk, an older child, an older brother or sister, took that child aside and taught him or her the Lord's prayers. First thing a child learned. There were 3 set meals a day, all served at regular times. At the age of 5, each child was given on his 5th birthday 1 day to learn the alphabet. Almost all of her children learned it on their 5th birthday. 1 or 2 of her children took a couple of days. She conducted school in her home 6 hours a day. Her daughter, Virginia, could read the New Testament in Greek by the time she was 8 years of age, as well as reading it, of course, in English. Each day, an older child took a younger one. I'm not reading Grimm's fairy tales. This is really history. Each day, an older child took a younger one and read to that younger child a psalm and a chapter in the Bible. Evening prayers were at 6 o'clock. Supper followed at 7 o'clock. The youngest went to bed, and by 8 o'clock, it was before TV and electricity. By 8 o'clock, all the kids were in bed. She spent 1 hour a week with each child alone, so that each child had significant time with her. In fact, John Wesley credits his ministry to that 1 hour a week he had a chance to be alone with his mother. John Benjamin Wesley, the 15th child, was actually named after two deceased children, John and Benjamin. She was the first Methodist, really. It was she that had the method. It was she that said order is heaven's first law. And in many respects, John Wesley simply put into existence what his mother had stood for. I'm fascinated with even how she approached death. She lived to see her sons, John and Charles, come to great fame, but at her deathbed she summoned her children together and she gave them stern instructions. She said, "Now children, when I am released, sing a hymn of praise to God." And she gave them the hymn. Somewhere I've got the words of the hymn. I didn't bring it with me tonight. But sure enough, when she expired, immediately her children who were gathered around her bed in respect for her wishes released and all sang together a hymn of her selection to God in praise. Now that, friends, be my way of living and going. I'd like to live that orderly. I'd like to die that orderly. I'm not saying that I've got everything that orderly yet, but I am working on it. And in fact, the Lord has spoken a lot to me recently about order in my life and bringing things, even bringing personal accounts into strict order, so that in the inner recesses of my life, in the drawers of my desk, where life really is often chucked away, there is a sense of order and priority. Susanna Wesley, like the ancient Joseph, chose not to live with all the shibboleths, all the phrases that the day was using that could have excused her and allowed her to cop out. She chose to resist, like Joseph, that strike against her and rise in spite of the environmental and family circumstances she had been saddled with. A second mistake or a second strike that was against Joseph, and it closely relates to the first, but I want to dwell with it more at length because we see it more fully developed in the book of Genesis. The second strike against Joseph was the mistakes in parenting that were made directly by his father. We all know the importance of a father relationship in life, and the absence of a father relationship can as well have serious consequences. As I look at Jacob and the relationship that he had with Joseph and his other sons, and it's not hard to spot these, he makes at least three critical mistakes in respect to his fatherly role. One mistake that he made is quite obvious, is that he idolized one son above the rest. That's sure danger and tragedy. He idolized Joseph. Probably the reason why he did this is that Joseph, the scripture says, was born to him when he was of old age, and also he was the first son born to his beloved wife Rachel. We know that he idolized Joseph from the standpoint that he gave Joseph a many-colored robe. And those of us that are growing up in the church can think now back to our Sunday school flannel graph story days of the beautiful robe that was put upon Joseph, and how all that seemed so right and proper back then. But how wrong psychologically and developmentally that really was. Because it was no ordinary coat. It was a robe that somebody that was a prince or a king would wear. And it was a robe that set him apart from the other children. And Joseph, it would be easy to see, is a person who begins to think of himself as a specially endowed individual because the sun rises and sets in him. I think that children that have a sense that the sun rises and sets in them because their parents idolize them, we're never made to be gods. And if our parents make us as children gods, then we're going to have some rather rough bruises in life to come to reality when we grow up. And Joseph has to have a lot of hard knocks to knock out this godlike quality in him, that he is this dreamlike kid against whom nothing bad can happen. The special treatment, too, that he was given by his father meant that the other sons knew that they were not as loved. And when love is denied, hate results. And so they hated their brother. If you make one child above all your other children a favorite child, and of course this is a case that is easy to happen where there are divided families and where there is remarriage. God must help parents in those kinds of situations to not put one child up on a pedestal and then use that child and say to the other brothers and sisters, well, you know, if you would just do it like Johnny does or Susie does. What that does, of course, is it helps Johnny or Susie to keep better behavior, but what it says to the other children is, you're not as good. And because they realize and know they're not as good, they will respond not by becoming like Johnny or Susie, but instead by becoming their reverse. And it's a reactive way of expressing anger in order to try to reach out and get love. It's a no-win situation all the way around. A second parenting mistake that Jacob made was that he failed to discipline his children. And we see three glaring examples of a failure of discipline in the text of Genesis. One is in Genesis chapter 34, a sordid story, the story of Dinah and Shechem. Shechem was not a member of the Abraham patriarchal family, therefore not a member of the line of promise. He had a passion for Dinah. He went in to Dinah, had relationships with Dinah, but he was not a love him and leave him kind of a man. He evidently genuinely loved Dinah, so he attempted to make up for his wrong by asking his father to intercede, and the two of them asked for the privilege of his marrying Dinah. And they agreed in Genesis chapter 34 to provide some sort of a dowry to make this possible. Jacob thought, therefore, at his other sons' urgings, that the whole thing could be taken care of if they would become circumcised, and therefore in that way express their fidelity to the God of Abraham and Isaac and of Jacob himself. Actually, the whole attempt to have Shechem and his father and all the men in their household and city to be circumcised was a ruse by Jacob's sons. For 2 days after they were circumcised, and while they were in a condition of weakness, Dinah's brothers, Jacob's sons, took sword in hand and went, and in the inability of Shechem and his fellow members of his household to defend themselves, all the men in that family and in that city were killed while they were in this state after having been circumcised. Now, Jacob's response to this situation is the wrong response. It's an incredibly fascinating response. His sons had did wrong. They had killed innocent people who were trying to atone for wrong which they had done. They come in then and they seize their property and plunder their goods, Genesis 34, 28, and 29. And when Jacob hears about it in verse 30, this is his response. Then Jacob said to Simeon and to Levi, "You have brought trouble on me." Notice that. He does not say to them, "You did wrong." He says, "You made me lose face." And when a parent's correction of a child is based upon the idea that your activity wasn't wrong of itself, but what you did made me lose face, they are on the wrong track. There are a lot of things kids can do to make us lose face, but that ought not to be the reason why we discipline them. When the discipline needs to be exercised, we need to say something to our children that Jacob didn't have the courage to say to his, and that is, "You did wrong." But there is no discipline. We never read of Jacob disciplining these children for this. A second case where Jacob failed to discipline is with Reuben, his oldest son, the firstborn son of Leah. In Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, we read that Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, an unheard of breach of morals even in the pagan world. And the response simply is that Israel or Jacob heard of it. Again, he does nothing. He simply receives the news, but he doesn't do anything with it. No other response. No letting Reuben know, "Reuben, you did wrong." It's interesting that while Jacob heard of it, he didn't forget it. 40 years later, when he is on his deathbed, he is blessing the various sons that come before him. And in Genesis chapter 49, we find what he says to his firstborn son Reuben, verses 3 and 4. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up upon your father's bed onto my couch and defiled it. Well, he never did anything to Reuben when the event happened. He stored it away in his memory, and it was still eating him on his deathbed 40 years later. He hadn't forgiven it, he hadn't forgotten it, and he never dealt with it. And he was a failure in that sense as a parent. It does no good to nurse and remember the wrongs that our children do to us later down the road. Somehow we must come to grips with them when they occur, letting the child know that what they have done is wrong, but moving on with life and not simply acting as if nothing happened. A third example of Jacob's failure to discipline, and what a classic example of bad parenting he is Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, that Joseph comes back and he brings a bad report concerning his brothers. Your guess is as good as mine as to what that bad report could be. It wouldn't surprise me that given what some of the activity the sons were in respect to anger and immorality, that this sort of thing was going on in their lives. Again, we don't read of any action of Jacob doing anything about it. He simply hears the report. In fact, a few days later, he hears that his sons are down in Shechem, and he sends Joseph to them to see how they're doing. It's very intriguing that he would send them to Shechem, because Shechem is where they had killed all of the people to rescue, so to speak, the name of their sister Dinah. And he is concerned when he hears they're again in Shechem. I think he's concerned because he's worried about what mayhem they may be up to again. And so he sends Joseph, his spy. But even though Joseph may bring back reports, and Joseph doesn't get back from this journey, as we all know, but although Joseph brought him reports, Jacob does nothing. A third mistake that Jacob makes as a parent is that he not only has a favorite, and not only does he fail to discipline, but he missed the signals his kids were sending him. I admit that it is not always easy to read children. And it's not always easy to read teenagers. It's certainly very difficult to read teenagers for those of you that are in that experience. And it helps if a family talks a lot. And if parents can learn the nonverbal signals. I'm trying to know what they are. But you can see Jacob's terrible failure. It'd be like, for example, if I had, with my two children, Evangeline and George Paul, when Evangeline graduates from high school next year, suppose that I decide that for her graduation present, I'm going to give her, a Corvette Stingray. I don't know where in the world I'd get the resources to do that, but let's just for fun suppose that I give her a Corvette Stingray. Say, that's my girl, she made it, she's the oldest, she gets the Stingray, you know. 4 years later, Georgie coming down the road, graduates from high school, and I give him a little box, and inside of it is a nice tie. Well, how in the world is George going to feel? Well, you know how he's going to feel. And when a child is picked at, as Joseph was, and given something that in his culture was the equivalent of a Stingray Corvette, and all the other kids were just getting ties, you better believe that Jacob was missing the signals with his children. And he didn't realize this sullenness in his sons that was breaking out against Joseph. Had he realized it, he would have known better than to send Joseph out to see how they were doing. He could have been suspicious of a plot that would have broken against them. He did not know his child's inner feelings. We can make it as a matter of prayer that God would help us to know our children's inner feelings. But in spite of those strikes against him, Jacob and Joseph indeed have a wonderful relationship when all the turbulence is over. God ultimately turned it for good, and in fact, down the road, Jacob's relationship with his sons, as Genesis 49 shows us, was largely repaired. God can overrule even the parenting mistakes that we make, but they can be a strike against us. Joseph again found some place, a position in God that the mistakes made against him did not ruin him, did not impair his service to God in life. I think a third strike against Joseph was his amazing immaturity and naivety. As a 17-year-old, he is excessively wet behind the ears. I mean, here is a boy who is having dreams about being the priority son. So he dreams that his sheaf of grain, verse 6 of Genesis 37, is out in the field when suddenly his sheaf rose and stood upright while the sheaves of his brothers gathered around mine and bowed down to it. That reminds me of a song that was popular when I was a teenager. You talk too much, you worry me to death. Any of you remember that? A few of you do. Yeah, you talk too much, you worry me to death. That's Joseph. He talked too much, he worried everybody to death. And there are some things, if we feel God is going to use us in some way or do something special in our life, some of the best things we can do is just shut up. But Joseph was mile a minute, had to talk his position up. I'm the best. And again, we can all think, young or old, of people we've known or ourselves who have talked too much about what we were going to do. And he not only makes a mistake once, he makes a mistake twice. He can see the resentment of his brothers after he told the first dream. He goes out and has another dream and comes right back and tells them the second dream about, listen, he says, verse 9, I had another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. Well, it didn't take a great interpreter of dreams to figure out he meant his 11 brothers, his mother, and his dad, the sun and the moon. And his brothers are rightly incensed with this behavior. I said several weeks ago in regard to Jacob that one psychologist or psychiatrist has said there are 4 kinds of egocentricity, self-centered types of persons. There's the Nero person who wants to dominate. There's a person that might be called a turtle who's self-centered inside a shell and nobody can reach them because they always withdraw. There's the clinging vine self-centered person who is basically parasitical and whose identity is totally made up in what other people or some special person thinks of them. And then the 4th kind of egocentricity is the star, the person who loves the limelight, who stars love to shine. They love adulation and glory. Jacob was a Nero kind of person. He had to dominate. He wanted to dominate from the day he came out of the womb. He was grabbing his brother's heel. Joseph was not a Nero person. Even though ultimately great power came to him, he was a star. He wanted to shine, and he wanted everybody to bow down. Stars love applause, and some kids just love to shine and love applause. But his dreams got him in trouble until even his father got just a little bit upset with him, although his father, verse 11, kept the thing in mind, which shows that Jacob had some of the spiritual sensitivity of his own mother, Rebekah, who also knew something special about Jacob's existence when he was born. Against that immaturity and naivety, God will have to do a work of reshaping Joseph's life. And to the egocentric person, to the self-centered person, to the self-sufficient person, there is no better way and no probably quicker way to remake that than to be shattered, to be tried, to be tested in a heads-over-heels situation. Joseph is going to be called to go through a crucible that his immaturity and naivety might give way, might yield to a better personality. As I look at the strikes against him and see what emerged, I come to the kind of bottom line of 3 applications that I close with this evening from this first look at Joseph's life. The one is, again, a word which I used this morning, but whenever we're together as Christians, we can never use this word too much. It is the word grace. God does overrule. God overrules our mistakes. He overruled Jacob's mistakes. Granted, he made mistakes in the number of wives that he had. Granted, he made mistakes in parenting that he had. But let's look at the fact that Israel came from Jacob. That the 12 tribes come from the 12 sons, and that composite group made God's people, from whom came the Messiah. And God, in his great grace and sovereignty, worked through a family situation that was very troubled to bring about his purposes. I think we ought to look at all of our failures in light of God's overruling, that we may come to a situation where we realize we've been at fault, we've made mistakes, and we feel very frustrated because we cannot undo those. We cannot unscramble an egg, as somebody said. Once the egg is scrambled, it cannot be unscrambled. But God, in his great grace and in his great mercy, can yet overrule and make it for good. A second kind of a lesson that in this early look at Joseph's life that I can pick up is the need for sensitivity. As parents, especially for parents who are here, we need to be sensitive in the discipline of our children. But we also need to be very sensitive if we are a non-favored child. And there are some children who I'm actually convinced are not non-favored children, but think they are. And every event that happens in their family, they read as a sign that they are not the special one that is the object of their parents' deepest love. I would say beware of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you get it between your ears that you're not a favored child, everything that happens will be filtered and interpreted by what you're thinking, and your parents can never prove to you opposite once you get that between your ears. And they could even make you their favored child, but you would go on believing that you weren't once you accept that analysis. If you know that you're not favored, ask the Lord to help you to avoid anger. You'll want to use anger to try to gain their love. You'll want to do things that will get attention. Don't do that. Respond in love, do good, let good replace evil. Change your attitude and your behavior, all easier things said than done, but sensitive to that fact. And you might in the soul of your existence ask yourself, even if you're old like me, am I a favored child? I believe my parents had an even-handed balance. My sister is here this evening. I know that although we were all treated equally, she was the favorite child. But I went ahead and turned out okay anyway. And our parents really treated us with great equality, although my brother was treated much better than I was. Now, Dad, I'll have to give you time to defend yourself, I know. Actually, I was the favorite child because God gave me the red hair that nobody else in the family had, and I was the only child born in America. The others were born in China. At some point in your life, you have to come to peace with where you came from and who your parents were and what happened to you, and to be sensitive to the fact that you're a special person and God can take the good and the bads and work them out for His glory and honor. I think a third lesson coming out of this is the benefit of fire in our life, the benefit of adversity and stress. We'll find Joseph next week going down into Egypt, but we know that when he emerges from Egypt, he will emerge a better person. Although he could have chosen not to emerge at all, or he could have chosen to emerge for the worse. It is Joseph's choices that count. I remember hearing a speaker once give us a message in which he started off by saying, there are some people who say, you are what you eat. And some of us well know that there is some degree of truth in that. And another person, he has said, you are what you read. And there is truth in that as well, because what we fill our mind with determines a great deal what we're going to be saying, thinking, and feeling. But he said, the most fundamental definition is you are what you choose. And I believe that's right. God has given you the freedom to choose. And you are becoming what you are choosing, not just what your parents have made you, not what your environment has made you, not what your church has made you. You are becoming what you are choosing to be. Like Joseph, may we choose to follow God. Our Father, in this evening hour, we give you thanks for the lesson of Scripture to our lives. We thank you for not only the positive example of Joseph, but for the beautiful example of Susanna Wesley, who gave to her children a heritage and gave to the world a benefit. Lord, in the making of our life, we pray that you would be present to us. There are many young people and teenagers and young men and women in their 20s in this audience this evening, and perhaps each of them can think of strikes against them. Maybe life isn't what ideally they would have liked it to be, and things have happened. Oh God, I pray that you would not let us simply walk in life with the chips on our shoulders and the strikes against us and how we were cheated here or deprived here or denied there. But you would help us to be courageous and firm in spirit and overcome that and have a deeper resiliency and a deeper level of confidence than that which simply derives by what happened to us in the past. Only you, Lord, can put courage within our breast. Only you can make us what we ought to be. And I pray, Lord, that we may turn from those things which would undo us to you, who can truly make us. Help us, Lord, to dream. Especially, Lord, in the times when dreaming seems futile because the odds against us seem so overwhelming. Help us to be people of vision. People who can somehow see a way, a place for us in your kingdom, a place for us to live productively and fruitfully in your vineyard. Grant it, Lord. Bless each person here this evening. May this be a wonderful evening for us for having gathered in your presence, and may our hearts have been strangely warmed by you. We ask in your name. Amen.